Thank you guys for coming back. At ASU, we measure the success of our performance based on retention. So I think I told you last week that in addition to being a professor, I also direct a very large writing program. We'll try to make the hour worthwhile for you. For those who are new, since Kelly asked me to introduce myself, I can do that again since I love talking about my family. My name is Kyle. I'm a professor at ASU. I specialize in rhetoric, which is a fancy way of saying that I study why people argue the way that they do. There's a lot of ways that you can study argument. I have a colleague, for example, her name is Cassie Lamp. She started as an archaeologist and now specializes in studying Roman architecture and how specific buildings engender certain ways of interacting with people and arguing with one another. I don't do that. I'm not that smart. I specialize in an area, I don't think I mentioned this last week, it's what's called modern rhetoric. And what modern rhetoric does is it basically tackles everything after 1950. So you say, well, why 1950? What's so big about that particular date? 1950 was right around the time of the publication of a really important book in rhetorical studies. It's called A Rhetoric of Motives. It was written by a man named Kenneth Burke. For lack of it, now that I'm being recorded, and please, I'll properly apologize for this, I'm one of the leading experts in the world in Kenneth Burke. Part of the reason why is because about 6, 7, 8 years ago, I discovered that A Rhetoric of Motives has a lost second half. It's called The War of Words. So you heard in the title of this particular talk that we said, how do we deal with the war of words? Well, the war of words is a term that's very peculiar to Kenneth Burke. You say, well, where did you find the book? How did you do it? That's probably a story for another day. But one of the really important insights that comes from the war of words is Kenneth Burke's insistence in the wake of all that has happened in World War II, with the emergence of propaganda emerging in newspapers and news media, that we think very, very carefully about how our consciousness works at any given moment. He says pretty explicitly, and I'm paraphrasing here, that we need to make our consciousness a matter of conscience. And what modern rhetoric recognizes is that there are ways that we can persuade one another. If I said to you, I would like you to like me. We do this all the time, by the way. And I need to learn something about my audience in order to make specific appeals that engender your affection. I might talk to you about wonderful things living in Arizona. I haven't interacted with a lot of people since moving to Arizona because 6 months after I got here, COVID hit, and we don't really know anybody here, and we're trying to figure out life in a post-viral world, I guess. So we push our daughters out in front. I mentioned last week that they look like lollipops. So they're blonde-headed lollipops, big heads, tall, skinny bodies. You've seen them, helping with service. In any case, if I was in Texas and I wanted to make a direct appeal, one of the things that I would talk about is how great Texas is. If I wanted to be really specific about it, I would talk about how great Texas barbecue is. And if I wanted to lie, I would say Whataburger is the best fast food burger on the planet. We've got our cameraman agrees with that. We'll start praying for you here very shortly. Okay? But those are direct appeals. We have a conscious effort to accomplish a specific type of goal. We study our audience and we say, all right, I'm going to make these appeals because in order to realize my purpose in light of what I know about my audience. That's not what modern rhetoric does. Modern rhetoric is a little bit more complicated. It tries to understand specifically how we become caught up in certain kinds of argumentative patterns and habits and ways of interacting with people that escape our conscious attention. So how is it that we'll do an exercise on this here in a moment, but it'll center around the question of where did you learn to listen? And if you're being good, proper students, you'll say, you'll say something like, I learned to listen from, and you'll tell me a really wonderful story about someone you love in your life, and then I will proceed to disentangle that argument in about 5 or 6 steps. Because the ways that you learn to listen are absolutely influenced by the people you love. My mother passed away a couple of years ago, or I guess it's a little more than a year ago, and she was, I love my mom. She was just intense and bright and funny in a way that was biting sometimes. That's where I get my sardonic sense of humor. But she was also she was very quick-tempered. And there were times when I was growing up where I would say to her, I need you to just grant me a hearing on this. One of my favorite memories of hers when I was in high school, I was a model kid in high school. Tara Lynn, you preached this morning about being like, oh, there were times when I was way better than you. I'm just going to tell you right now. I was way better.
I can tell from how you are now.
Yeah. I took a turn around 21. Yeah. That was when I met my wife. In any case, I was a kid, never got into trouble. I was an honors student. I was an all-state basketball player. I went to church. I became a believer. I mentioned to some of you last week, I became a believer, and then my parents both became believers afterwards. I'm really grateful that I can bear witness to that testimony. And I remember one time, it was after I had graduated, we were going around to these graduation parties, and my best friend from the time I was third grade, his name was Daniel Steele. Okay? Also a Christian. Yes, he did get teased, for those of you who know about the author who writes romance novels. He was also kind of buff, so he's put that to rest real fast. We went to a party, and he and I lived very closely with one another. And this was a proper Christian high school party. We went there and we sat and we talked about what hymns we liked the best. I mean, that's an exaggeration, but it's not that far off. Okay? And Daniel decided to get a ride home from another friend. I had driven him out here, and the plan was for us to return home together, and I was going to drop him off, and he didn't tell me. And so I was waiting around at the party, what is going on? Where is Daniel? I can't seem to find him. Lo and behold, I look at my watch, and I'm 20 minutes past curfew, and I'm a 35-minute drive away. So I'm like, well, I don't know where Daniel is. Maybe he's found his way home. This was before cell phones, long time ago. I was telling my students the other day, I'm 40 now, and that's a little bit weird for me. And they're like, what was it like, when you were in college? And I'm like, I don't think you want to ask me that question right now. So I hustled home. I arrived home, and it was about, I think, 11:15 at night. I opened the door, and I'm thinking, trying to creep in. I didn't do anything wrong, per se. I was out past my curfew for the right reasons. I was trying to look after my friend, and I'm kind of like this. I'm a big guy, right? Back then I was a lot skinnier, and I'm thinking that somehow someone's gonna see over my shoulder. And my mom pops in, and she goes, "Give me the car keys." And I was like, okay. And she goes, "You give me those car keys right now. You're in big trouble, mister." And I was so taken aback. I'd never gotten in trouble before, never like this. And I started laughing. I was like, oh, okay, here you go. Here are your keys. And she goes, "Thank you. We'll talk about this in the morning." And I was like, okay. That was my mom in a nutshell. Burned hot quickly, and then in the process of kind of reflecting, stood back, and we could then sit and have a dialogue. I'm very similar with my children. And I have to acknowledge the legacy of those argumentative tendencies. It's not something when my children do something that irritate me, which is almost never, right? You guys been around children? They never irritate us. I burn hot. I don't want to grant a hearing. I will say to my daughter Leah, who's constantly pleading for a hearing, and the irony is palpable, I'm aware, help me, let's talk about this. And I'm like, no. This is an exercise in which you are quiet and I speak. Be quiet and do what I ask you to do. We have a rule in our house, listen and obey. The irony is I don't have to apply that rule to myself until I'm ready. It's the blessing of being a parent, I guess. In any case, in those moments I have to pause and reflect and think, where did I inherit these patterns of behavior? Because there isn't a moment in my life where I stop and consciously pause and think, all right, I'm going to be like my mom right now. I'm not saying consciously, okay, burn hot, alienate everybody around you, even potentially to the point of laughter, and then circle back for a hearing later on. That'll really warm them up to you. As a scholar, that's what I study. Like, why don't we think about that, but we route that through our lives? I can use the example of my mom, but I can also use plenty of examples in which the media that I choose to listen to, the company that I choose to keep, the kinds of books that I read, the kinds of books that I write, have a fundamental impact on how I conceptualize the way I interact with and am willing to listen to others. I'm making a conscious volitional choice to do that, but I'm not always making a conscious volitional choice at how those things influence me as they route through me. Does that make sense to everybody? And so as a scholar, I'm fascinated by this. My new research, Wes, I was going to tell you this. I know I owe you an email. I booked a flight to, or I'm in the process of booking a flight to Cambridge in the UK, because I'm going to write a new book called A Genealogy of Motives. What I want to understand is, where does the idea of modern motive come from? Like, why we do what we do. And I'm going to Cambridge to study a guy named Frederick Myers. And you're like, who is Frederick Myers? I've never heard of this guy. I bet you have. Raise your hand quickly if you've heard of the term telepathy. He invented it. Do you know why he invented it? Because he was trying to explain how people could be in a room and influence one another without being fully conscious of being able to do so. Everybody has walked into a room and say, we're going to take the temperature of a room, right? Or walked into a tense situation and without even consciously being aware of it, bow up a little bit, as they like to say in Texas. So that's what I study. I want to make sense of it. What we're going to talk about today, I think, is really important. That the phrasing that I'm going to give you is complicated, but it's intuitive, and I'm going to show you how we can kind of work through this as listeners. Okay? When it comes to argument, there are two really important factors. There's the content that we argue about, so the what that we're arguing about. So in this case, you can say, like, my daughters bicker with one another. I don't understand this because I was an only child. So my daughters start bickering with one another. I have a very low threshold for that. And I say, what are you arguing about? And typically it's, she looked at me in a way that I did not appreciate. So, well, what did that look like? Like, what did that entail? And they try to mimic it, and they'll like, oh, she gave you the stink eye? And she's like, yes, she gave me the stink eye. And I'm like, okay, can you work it out? So they're debating about, it starts with something about a look, and then it becomes about who has the right to give the look at what particular time, and escalates appropriately until they're ready to murder each other. At which point my wife, the educational administrator, intervenes. I go read a book, and we're all happy. Okay? So there's the what we argue about, the content we argue about. Everyone who wants to learn how to argue more effectively is constantly asking about the content. How do I present my content in a way that is persuasive to other people? Guess what? That's the wrong question to ask. And there may be, now that this is being recorded, this maybe will end up on the internet, and my colleagues across the country and world will be like, actually, he's wrong. You should be really thinking about this differently. But as a modern rhetorician who's teaching the class, it's my prerogative to tell you what I think is most important. You can pray about it and let the Spirit guide you as to what is actually, in fact, most important. I actually think that the most important thing is what I would call the content of the form. The content of the form. I told you the phrase was a little bit kind of clunky. The idea that how you argue, how you listen, the stance within which you adopt, irrespective of content, actually has a fundamentally more persuasive capacity than what you're actually talking about. Want me to give you an example? Good. As if you had a choice. We're just here for the food. When I was in Texas, I had a friend who is a pastor of a very small church. It was kind of a startup church. And just really had a strong heart for wanting to build a community. I always appreciated that about him. And he was always, I think, in the way that our church leadership does, trying to preach in a way that was relevant to timely issues. And you hear us talking as a church about the war in Ukraine and how do we be responsive to that? How do we exhibit tender hearts toward that, to remember that God's hand is sovereign even when things seem to be falling into disarray. I happened to be out of town when this friend of mine was delivering a sermon right around the time of where the Supreme Court made the decision to allow gay marriage. And he said, Kyle, you were out of town. But I want your opinion on this. And I had said, okay, I'll listen to it. Send me the link. And he sent me the link. And then I listened to the sermon. And I think it was fairly consistent in alignment with his theology, probably fairly in alignment with what you would imagine are the politics of the North Dallas area. And I said, well, why don't I take you to lunch? And he goes, okay, I know I'm in trouble now. So if I ever ask you to lunch and offer to pay, that's what's happening, okay? Be careful what you wish for. I sat down with him and I said, all right. He goes, what did you think? I thought it was outstanding. And I said, he goes, what did you think? And I said, well, let's talk about delivery. I said, I want you to reflect for a moment on an analogy that I'd like to give you here for a moment. And he said, okay. I said, his wife's name is Mandy. I said, all right. You ever get frustrated with Mandy? He's like, yeah, of course. So you guys ever argue about things? He's like, yeah. I said, okay. Let's say you decide at a particular moment that you are going to give a sermon about all the things that you don't like about Mandy. So you say, Mandy, when I come home, I expect a hot dinner and the dinner's always cold. When I want my wash done, the wash isn't ever really quite put together the way I expect it to be. When I look at you interacting with our kids, there are some things I admire about it, but for the most part, I think you need to make certain kinds of adjustments that are more in line with God's will. And you proceed to go along. And I gave him about 20 different examples. And then I said, but at the end, you turn the card. It's a poker play, right? And you said, but you're a child of God and Jesus loves you. I said, how would Mandy respond to you? He said, I wouldn't be married anymore. And I said, that's exactly right. There's a content to the form. You can be correct and deliver incorrectly and be more persuasive in the incorrectness of your delivery, and in the process completely erode the conditions wherein someone might have been willing to listen, and they're choosing not to, simply because we haven't created the conditions in ourselves to grant a hearing and to be granted a hearing. Does that make sense to everybody? So these particular tactics, I believe in symmetry. So I've given you how to make conflict way worse than it needs to be, and then how to encourage productive disagreement. The goal is productive disagreement because here's the truth in the war of words, okay? The truth in the war of words is that disagreement is going to obtain, irrespective of how hard you work at it. One of my favorite people in the world, also a co-author, she also happens to be my boss. She's the chair of the English department at Arizona State University, founded an area of research called rhetorical listening. We've got a book coming out, I think on April Fool's Day. I may have mentioned that last time. We find that very funny. Called Rhetorical Listening in Action. And she and I are very busy administratively, but sometimes we have moments where we can catch up. So I happened to catch her on the phone. We were talking about administrative issues, and I will periodically ask about her daughter who lives in a separate region of the U.S. I said, how's Olivia doing? And she said, oh, Kyle, you're not going to believe what I did. And I said, what happened? And she goes, well, Olivia was trying to travel for her job, and she called me up and said, Mom, I don't want you to try and solve this problem. I just want you to listen to me. Like literally, explicitly says this. And proceeds to tell her about going everything. And Chris, being a brilliant administrator, being, abundant in her love for her daughter, proceeds to start trying to solve the problem. And she said to me two things that I thought were really humbling. Number one, she said, go figure, the person who founded an area of research called rhetorical listening can't even listen effectively to the person that she loves the most on this world, even when she explicitly asks me to do so. And in the process of conveying that sense of humility, models precisely why conflict obtains, irrespective of situation. I will give you these tactics. I will talk you through them. You will look at me. You will nod. You will walk out. You will feel inspired to go and have productive disagreements. You're willing to listen. You adopt an open stance. You're like, I know what that is. And you will fail. Absolutely. 100% of the time. So why try? Well, for the same reason that I study rhetoric, because modern rhetoric in particular, because the content of the form can be persuasive. We talked last week about rooting our listening habits in the foundation of God's sovereignty. Wes and I corresponded. He's like, maybe you should define God's sovereignty. And it set me off for like 3 days trying to figure out how to provide a pithy definition of God's sovereignty.
That was my goal.
Thank you. It was a nice distraction from some other things. And what I have come up with is just, I'm going to say a simple answer, and then I'm going to give you a more complicated one. The simple answer is the acknowledgement, the full acknowledgement that God is in control, and that in his control, he is structuring whatever he has created toward an outcome that he would like to see. That's God's sovereignty, at least as I understand it. We can quibble about it. You're probably right. But that's the best I can do after a weird week. Okay? The more complicated answer, and this is where, Wes, I think I was kind of getting hung up a little bit. How do we conceptualize God's sovereignty? That's an open question. How do we imagine a God who stands outside of time, who created everything, who in the process of creating everything says to you, not only do I know you, I can count the hairs on your head. Chooses to incline his ear toward our prayers, exhibits total grace, asks for virtually nothing in return. We only know that in negative relationship. We only know that as a negative relationship, meaning we are time-bound. We ask for more than we give. We are not in control. We don't know how. I'm getting better at this as I'm getting older. I'm able to count the hairs on my head a little bit better. But even then, I don't even know myself as intimately as I should, let alone someone else. We know what God's sovereignty is in negative relation, and we take as an article of faith, and this is the key, that the Bible is true. That article of faith is a really important term because it pushes us into a stance of humility. Does that make sense? Like if we know that we're time-bound, we know that we're finite, we know that we can't see anything, much less control anything, can't even count the hairs on our heads, don't even know why we do what we do, can't even properly locate it all the time and very accurately, what that should push us into is a space of like, wow, I'm so glad that there is something that I believe in that can accomplish those things. And if we do that, if we remember that that's the provision, that's the trust, that's the content that precedes us before any kind of productive disagreement, then we can say, regardless of what happens, the form I will adopt, the content of the form that I will adopt as a believer is rooted in humility. If we can do this one simple thing, wherein we say, whatever the engagement, whatever the content, whatever the person, regardless of what will happen, I will call myself consciously to remember that I need to be humble, that God is sovereign, and that even in this moment, the act of exhibiting that kind of humility toward another person, being willing to grant a hearing, provides a testimony about what we believe, even when we fail. We have to believe that. We have to trust that. That's the basis of our faith. Thank God, right? Thank God it's not up to us. Thank God that for those of you who are coming back, we don't have to bury the pink rubber duck in our belly. If you guys don't know what I'm talking about, ask someone who was here last week, okay? We can hold open our hand. We can trust something that is far more powerful, that can do far more with it than we can on our own. So when you think about listening, whatever the topic, whatever the form, I want you to remember that you are called first to be a believer. You are called first to bear witness to a grace that you can't wrap your head around. If you begin there, then you're going to engage in a content of form that allows other people to soften, or at least create the possibility of a softening. And that's all, I think, the best we can do, at least as an initiative stance. Okay, so how to make conflict worse than it needs to be. Number one, you can refuse to grant a hearing. There are ways that we can do this, both consciously and non-consciously. You can say, the easy one to wrap your head around is the conscious unwillingness to grant a hearing. I have made up my mind about this. I know what you think. I know what you're going to say. The outcome is inevitable. Let's not do this. Let's agree to disagree. You guys ever do that? Yeah, not cool. By the way, I do it too, just so you know, all the time. And I teach this stuff. Isn't that the irony? You have established a conclusion before you've given space for the process. And that is an argumentative content that is formal in quality. And people, let me ask you this, just, has anybody ever here been in an argument before? You're loud. You have? I doubt that. You look so nice. Have you ever been in an argument with somebody who refused to grant you a hearing? Who said, I am unwilling to hear whatever reasons you have to give in this moment. We really don't need to do this. My grandkids. But if, I'll talk to them and pray for them. Okay? You've been in those situations, right? How did it feel? I want you to sit in the pocket of that feeling for a moment. What did it feel like to experience? You're probably not even remembering the content right now. So that's a person who shut things down before I even was allowed to speak. And even when I spoke, I knew that they were assigning properties, values, whatever, to whatever I'm saying in order to bolster their own sense of virtue. How'd that feel?
Like a squished bug.
Yeah, right? It's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking. We can do that if we don't pay attention to how we formally position ourselves in an argument. And here's what's worse. Modern rhetorical theory all but says that you will do that and not be aware of the fact that you're doing that. So here's the question. In what context do you find yourself being unwilling to grant a hearing, and in the process of being unwilling to grant a hearing, discourage those from being willing to even approach you? I don't worry about the arguments that I have. I can work within them fluidly. I've become very practiced, as Tara Lynn talked about this morning, of saying, I'm sorry, I was wrong here. The arguments that keep me up at night are the ones that I never have because I've convinced other people that I'm unapproachable. Those are all opportunities for testimony that I need to account for and have failed at. That's heartbreaking to me. And it should be to you as well. All of those times when someone would otherwise have approached you and you convinced them that you were unapproachable. So how do we remedy this? Well, there are formal ways that we can grant a hearing. One of the things that people consistently ask me is, well, what do you do, like practically speaking? Like, what do you say in these particular situations? And one of the things that I say in this particular instance is, look, you know me well enough to know that I have strong opinions on a lot of issues. But here's the absolute truth of the situation. I am, as a matter of principle, willing to learn. And what I need your help with in this particular situation, I need to understand how you're seeing this particular issue so that I can learn how to align or, in some cases, misalign my perspective with yours. Here's what you need to know. And this is something I actually saw, I don't know if this is like hearsay or not. This is something that Jeff Bezos actually applies. He has allegedly has a strategy in his boardroom that they say things like, I don't agree with you, but I will support you. And I literally said that thing to my wife this morning. I don't agree with how you're approaching this, but I will support you irrespective. And in that moment, what I'm trying to do is suspend our differences long enough to grant a hearing so that I allow myself to catch up. On this particular issue, I am not particularly convinced that my wife and I will line up. It's an issue that we have disagreement on, and historically so. But in doing that, in knowing that I'm going to support her irrespective of whether or not we agree, that issue gets taken off the table fully. It doesn't become a zero-sum game where you say, either you agree with me or I agree with you. What we say is, we are going to move together forward. Part of the process of my ability to move forward is to grant a hearing in order for you to be able to say, I don't agree, but I will support you. By the way, that's not like the new modern version of agree to disagree. That, please don't misunderstand that. You have to be willing to hear, to say, I want to understand where you're coming from on this. For you to, in earnest, be able to say, I don't agree. But again, the underlayment for that, I don't agree, but I will support you, is, but I'm willing to learn. And this conversation can evolve over longer periods of time. This is the thing that, as a scholar, as a Christian, I've had to learn. I tend to be, my wife argues pretty consistently that I love conflict, and I'm not sure that I love conflict. I think the thing that I would say I love is resolution. I like when resolution occurs. I'm gratified when a problem is solved in a way that allows certain outcomes to be met. And if conflict is the step that needs to be taken in order for that resolution to be achieved, I'm cool with it. However, one of the things that we need to make sure that we pay attention to at any given moment when we're engaging in conflict, when we're engaging in resolution, is that we learn that not every problem needs to be solved right this moment. Remember I told you the lineage of my listening, I burn hot and want to seek resolution quickly. I learned that from my mom. I get uncomfortable when there's long stretches of tension between people. I want it. I study the tools for a living so that I don't have to deal with that garbage. My wife is far more comfortable with that than I am. She is what you would call long-suffering and patient and kind. I am not those things by definition. So in that moment, I have to be willing to hear her form. You understand what I mean by that? I have to be willing to allow her to educate me, to say, this problem is not a sprint, it's a marathon. You need to be patient. You need to grant it a hearing. You need to listen to me multiple times before you render a judgment. And in the process of us doing that, we're walking together. We're not competing with one another. Does that make sense to everybody? Is this helpful to you? Okay. How to make conflict way worse than it needs to be. Number 2. I feel like I'm David Letterman here. Less entertaining, I'm sure. Deny the value of different perspectives. We can do this consciously and non-consciously. We can deny the value of different perspectives by simply saying, I do not want to hear a perspective that is different than my own. We call this thing echo chambers. Social media is exceptional at creating echo chambers wherein we naturally embody the rhythms of certain kinds of argumentative forms that convince us of our own virtue because all we ever hear is our own virtue, which is by definition not really virtue. So we're making conscious, rigorous attempts at trying to persuade ourselves of our own value. I don't know how to explain it except to say, like, I'm working on some research right now that is characterizing it as a form of saturation. That we allow the formal rhythms of our argumentative lives to become so saturated by what we already see that we only see what we expect to see. Okay? That's a conscious volitional act. You can make a choice to do that or not. But we can also deny the value of different perspectives through indifference, non-consciously through indifference, through not making a conscious effort to seek out perspectives that are different than our own. I have a friend, maybe eventually will become a family member, I hope. He's in a relationship with Patty's cousin, second cousin, I don't know. He's a wonderful guy. He just became Scottsdale PD. And he went to a university called Pacific Lutheran, which I happen to know quite well because I grew up a stone's throw away from it. It's a liberal arts university in Tacoma, Washington. Has anybody ever been to Tacoma besides me? No, just me? Oh, there we go. All right, Pacific Northwestern right there. So this particular person and I were having dinner together. I made him dinner, so we had to have a talk. Okay. I made him what I knew he would really like. This was not a planned intervention, I promise. And he wanted to talk with me about how I interpreted the protests of police brutality. I said, oh, okay, we're just going to go light here tonight, evidently. I said, well, let me ask you a question. It's a simple question. In your training over the last 6 months, did you ever read a book that was written by a black man or woman that described what it was like to live in a country where they were afraid that justice would not have been served? And he said, I'm going to do you one better in answering your question. I said, okay. And he said, I have never read a book written by a black man or woman. I said, what? After a liberal arts private education, you have not read a book written by someone who was not white? And he goes, no. I said, well, I've got the solution to your problem. Read this book. And I gave him a book. And I said, we'll see you next time. Is he going to read the book? I don't know. I hope so. It's a good book. It's about police and justice. It's a book called The Nickel Boys by Colson Whitehead. Have you read it?
Yep, we read it as part of one of our here at church.
Yeah. It's a good book. I will also eventually hand him a book that is written by a professional acquaintance named Michael Eric Dyson, who is an ordained minister and who talks pretty consistently and actively about the importance of attending to the history of violence that has characterized our country. Now, whatever step you want to take after that, we have to deal in facts. That police brutality takes place. And we need to understand from the perspective of those who are subjected to that police brutality what it is like. That is a formal act, a willingness to say, I am willing to grant a hearing. I'm willing to understand that which I cannot understand. I've only been pulled over one time in my life. It was when I was 16 years old in Spokane, Washington, driving down Division Street. I didn't see that the speed limit had changed from 35 to 25. I was going down a hill. It pulled me over. I thought my dad was going to murder me. He didn't, because I didn't get a ticket. I probably looked scared. Police officer was gracious. Okay. And I can confidently say that since I was 16 years old, I've never ever even been pulled over. I don't know what it's like to drive through a city, St. Louis, Chicago, New York. I've been through all of these places and worry that I might, for whatever reason, be stopped. That doesn't fit within my consciousness. Does that make sense? And we can say, well, there aren't reasons why that actually occurs. There are probably good reasons why people stop. Maybe that's true. Or maybe it's that the people who stop them don't communicate why they're stopping them. Or their communications are limited to what they're willing to say. Does that make sense? Either way, we still find ourselves in this kind of factually complicated, fraught space where there is no possibility of reconciliation. We can't come to terms. Does that make sense to everybody? That's a formal quality, not a content quality. So we need to actively make that, we need to be aware of that if we want to get better at listening. So what do? We can adopt an open stance. Let me be very, very clear about something. Adopting an open stance is a willingness to grant a perspective that is different than your own a hearing. But, and I want you to make sure you pay very particular attention to this, but being willing to grant a hearing doesn't mean that you're committed to being persuaded by it. You can say, I've granted you the hearing, I don't agree. You can also say, I don't agree, but I will support. Or you can simply say, we can't go further. And then you take the next step. That doesn't also absolve you from having to learn more. You may need to learn more. Maybe at that particular moment, you're not in a place where you can grant a hearing to a perspective and say, you know what, I do need to have a change of heart. That's between you and God. But what we can absolutely do is say, I am willing to grant a hearing. Now, one of the things that I get asked and my colleague gets asked pretty consistently is, well, what about people who have particularly vitriolic arguments that they want to spread around? You say, well, you can also choose not to grant a hearing, depending on the principles that you live by. If someone wants to say, you know what, I think pedophilia is okay, I'm going to say, you know what, we probably shouldn't have a conversation about this right now. If they say things like, you know, I think women are lesser than men, be like, no, we don't. That's a premise that we can't move beyond. Does that make sense? There are all sorts of no-fly zones. I know what they are. I've cataloged them. Okay? And I can make a conscious decision to say, listen, I don't want to erode the possibility of us having conversations in the future, but you need to understand that on that line, that's a non-negotiable for me. We can talk about other things. We can work through whatever questions you might otherwise have. But if you're going to take that particular formal argumentative stance, we don't have a place to go. So I want you to hear me when I say that adopting an open stance is not a free-for-all. It's not I have to listen to everything. It's certainly not I have to be persuaded by everything. But on issues that are not, for you, an unequivocal, that's a no-fly zone, you can say, okay, I could learn something here. And you can say, I want to try and understand from that person's perspective the reasons that they hold for seeing the world that they do. Formally, you're persuading them that their perspective is worth hearing. And that's an outcome that matters, even if you ultimately disagree. Does that make sense? You had a question.
Have you ever had it happen when someone makes a statement like, I see nothing wrong with pedophiles? If you ask that person to tell you about it, does it ever work?
I will say I used a really hyperbolic example, and I'm gonna have to put, I've never had someone say to me in my life, like, I think pedophilia is a good thing. And I would be like, tell me more about that. Like, I can't imagine a scenario where I would be like, I'd just be like, okay, I'm gonna call the police, give me your name and number, sign an autograph, I'm recording this now. No, it's,
When somebody says something.
but it depends. I had an engagement with a student this semester who, as far as I could tell, was a believer and espoused a very narrow view of what it meant to be a believer. I identified myself as a believer as well, and he proceeded in the process of this course that I'm teaching this semester to undermine me at virtually every turn, to the degree where he essentially said, oh, this thing that you're talking about, I'm teaching a class on group identification, and we're using cults as examples to kind of study how groups form and persuade each other to do potentially dangerous, nefarious things. And one of the things that we study we're studying research from psychologists, from theologians, from any number of areas of research. And they all seem to identify that confession is a very important formal tool for propaganda, re-education, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what I've said is, like, we just need to come to terms with this. Like, if all of these people are providing ample documentation that this is a principal strategy, we need to address it as a possibility. And he said, the only reason why these people write these things is because they hate Christians and they have an axe to grind. And I said, listen, that's a no-fly zone. Here's why. Because we are not exhibiting a willingness to entertain the possibility that they could be correct, and in the process of doing that, denying the value of their work. You might, after reading their research and being able to explain it on its own terms, say, I simply don't agree, and here are the reasons why I don't agree. But to dismiss it out of hand, to simply say no, is anti-intellectual. And for me, that's a no-fly zone. So I could have said to him, tell me more about why you think that they have an axe to grind with Christianity. I did not do that. Because for me, it was a no-fly zone. And my job is to teach him. And part of that is to establish limits. Does that make sense? So I guess what I would say is that's a very common tactic. That's interesting. Tell me more. I've also been in situations like that where I've made an argument where someone has said to me, that's interesting, and I knew what they really meant was, hey, that's stupid. Tell me more is not an exercise in anything but politeness. So in those moments, I guess what I would say is this is why I want you to pay attention to your argumentative habits, the tactics you use to express your willingness or unwillingness to listen. Because sometimes when you say things like, you think you are saying, oh, tell me more about this, it's really an exercise in collecting for rejecting the person even further. And that can, sometimes it is, right? So, and again, there are situations in which that's appropriate. I'm not saying it's a hard and fast rule. What I'm trying to help you develop is a sensibility, to be aware. It's like this is a really wonderful story. When I was an undergraduate, I was a basketball player, and as a part of our liberal arts education, I needed to take an aerobics class to fulfill my graduation requirements because I needed to learn how to be athletic. I thought that was really funny to me. And I happened to be, like, we all did this, all of the athletes did it like their last semester right before they graduated, because I'm like, I don't want to do this. And I happened to be in a class, a water aerobics class. Yes, that really happened. You can look it up. It's on my transcript, with a bunch of swimmers. Water aerobics for swimmers and basketball players. And I remember one time we were doing this exercise, and I was sitting next to one of these really great swimmers in our college, and he was doing breathing exercises. He was quite literally trying to calm himself down so that he could have a greater level of breathing capacity while he was in the water. And so he calmed slowly, breathe in, breathe out. He was watching himself breathe. We can do that when we argue. We can watch ourselves breathe. And the very act of watching ourselves breathe, again, it's the content of the form. When you watch yourself breathe, what happens? All of a sudden, you start breathing differently. You're like, oh, I didn't realize X, Y, and Z was happening. And in the process of doing that, maybe you alter things. Maybe you make certain kinds of adjustments. Maybe you reroute your habits differently. You can do the same thing with argument. Okay, so since we have 10 minutes left, I'm going to go over all things really quickly. I'm sorry, I wasn't anticipating it would go quite this slowly. But here we go, nonetheless. Maybe we'll have to go to part 2 for next week. Number 3, act like arguments are contagious. Arguments can be contagious. There are times when that is particularly the case. We can look at situations where we say, oh, that is clearly finding appeal when it should not. And the only way to describe what's happening is it's like people are infected by bad thinking, bad reasoning, etc. But that's not what I'm talking about here. Observing that something is happening is not using that as a matter of principle when you interact with somebody. Does that make sense to you? In other words, you can quite literally, when you are interacting with someone, say, I can't hear that. As if someone was literally coughing at you in the middle of COVID. There are all sorts of ways that these argumentative habits manifest in our day-to-day lives. One of the things that particularly irritates me when I'm in argument is if someone laughs when I'm presenting an argument in earnest. They'll go, they might be uncomfortable, but they're about to be even more uncomfortable because that's a no-fly zone for me. Don't laugh. It undermines the legitimacy of what I'm earnestly trying to communicate. You can say, I'm not sure I agree with that. I have certain kinds of non-conscious argumentative habits, like if I'm really unwilling to be persuaded, you will catch me doing this right here. Do you see my mouth? I literally do that. So if you see this face, don't bother. Just give me a minute. I need time. Okay? My wife sometimes will, when we will have an argument, she will look past me. Because what literally non-symbolically communicating or symbolically communicating is that we are defending ourselves against the possibility of being infected by a certain kind of idea. We can adopt this stance to the degree that we quite literally have this phrase, undo by overdoing. We can undo our relationships because we are so afraid that the perspectives that are different from our own are going to find persuasive appeal against the poor, innocent fools who are going to be naturally inclined to hearing this thing and not knowing the truth, that we quite literally unravel the legitimacy of our own stance because we're preoccupied with someone else's persuadability. Does that make sense? As Christians, we need to be confident in what we believe to be true. Remember what I said about God's sovereignty, right? God reigns whether we recognize him or not. God reigns when we fail and especially when we fail. As an article of faith, we can trust in moments that no matter how bleak things are, no matter how much the world is unraveling around us, we have to believe as a matter of faith that God is in control. His sovereign hand will guide us through it. And when we do that, it's really wonderful. The form that we adopt in that moment is we say, it's yours. I can't exert control anymore. The control that I'm attempting to graft onto this situation is not doing nothing but producing the opposite of the consequences that I want to see. And in relinquishing control, in what I would say decentering the self, you quite literally might be creating the conditions whereby you realize the outcome that you want to seek. Sometimes the little pink duck that we're burying in our bellies to protect it from God is us. It's our sense of self, our sense of pride, our sense of control. Arguments are contagious, maybe. But is that really how you want to proceed? If you do, you're likely to try to, as much as possible, indemnify yourself against them. And then all you really come across doing in those moments is you come across as threatened. And that is a stance that is non-persuasive by definition. So what do? You remember that being open to an argument doesn't mean being persuaded by it. You can grant a hearing to perspectives that are different than your own without being convinced by it. It happens all the time. And guess what is even better news? You can hear a perspective that is different than your own, grant a hearing, and still support the person who levied a perspective that is different than yours. You can. I did it this morning. It's magical. And you can learn to form relationships that say, you know what, in spite of our differences, we still have a fundamental commitment to seeing one another realize the best version of ourselves. And not everything needs to be done right this moment. This is a listening capacity you call suspension. We'll talk about this maybe next week. You suspend long enough, you're patient enough, you're long-suffering enough, because you know that you need grace just like that person does. Does that make sense? Okay. Number 4. Assume that terms don't need to be negotiated. You see the phrase tripping over tropes. Look, here's an absolute fact about the war of words. The way we define terms, you heard me do this in the opening preamble, God's sovereignty. There are people who would define God's sovereignty differently using different examples or whatever. Does that make them wrong? Maybe we can muddle through together as a possibility, argumentatively speaking. But here's the absolute tactic that I want you guys to walk away from today. This is something I teach my undergraduate students and graduate students as well. If you want to win an argument, and by winning, what I mean is seek an outcome that is consistent with your faith, get in the habit of saying, when I use this particular term that we're debating over, this is how I define it. Here's why. When you don't define your terms, you assume, wittingly or unwittingly, that a person agrees with you, and they may not. And then your argument becomes less about what you're happening to try and discuss, and more about why you think that person should assumptively agree with your definition of the world. Has that ever happened to you before? Where you start to become preoccupied with whether or not the person's assumptions about you are correct rather than what you're actually talking about? That's the content of the form. Does that make sense? One of the ways around this particular problem is to simply say, you keep consistently, this would be a good question to ask, for example, like, tell me more. Say, you keep using this term, and I'm interested in how you're defining it because I'm not sure I fully understand how I recognize that it's fundamental to how you're seeing the world, but I'm not entirely sure I fully understand why it's so important. Can you help me understand it by defining it? They will not be able to do it 99 times out of 10. Because argumentatively speaking, we have this tendency to assume that people agree with us. I do it all the time. So don't feel bad if you feel that way. We have to, in some ways, theoretically presume that in order to reach common ground. And you kind of we have these really great habits. There's really wonderful research that says we, over the course of dialogue, find middle ground because we presume that another person can understand us. Okay? But that's a practical question you can ask. You keep using this term. Can you elaborate for me? I did this at a very small conference one time. There's a professor that I really admire. He's very, very sharp. And he kept using a term, and I raised my hand and I said, listen, I know that you've got this fully formed thing, but could you just define for me really quickly what you mean by that term? And he scrambled and did a good job, by the way, because he's really bright. And then afterwards, he came up shaking his fist. He's like, why are you putting me on the spot? He wasn't actually mad. He's like, why are you putting me on the spot? I had no idea how to define the term. But thank you for asking me to do that because it actually helped me clarify what was particularly at stake in this situation. I do this all the time with my daughters for what it's worth, and I know that we're running out of time here. This is a perennial problem for me. Next week, do you guys want to go through the second half of this? Yes. Okay. Will you come back, please? I will do this regularly with my daughters. And you probably have too with people that you love. My daughters will routinely apply a a framework of fairness if they don't like a particular outcome. Has that ever happened to you before? They'll say to me, "That's not fair." And I will look at them and I'll say, "Could you please define fairness for me?" And then they roll their eyes. I said, no, this is a serious exercise. Please define fair for me. It's really important that you define fairness, because what I would like for you to do in the process of defining fairness is to begin accounting for unearned blessings. Is it fair that you were born into a family that has enough money every single day to provide you with food, clothes? You realize that there are a lot of families, most families across this world, that cannot say that confidently. Is it fair that I have to mediate this conflict? And we kind of proceed down the line, and they go, no. But then we need to take an important step. And you say, explain to me what you understand fairness to be. And what they do is they say, well, in this particular instance, it's beautiful. They say, in this particular instance, what I was saying was fair is X, Y, and Z. And I can say, okay. But when you make that argument, you need to make it precisely. You can say, I don't think it's fair that when I ask Gwendolyn to please stop and I used kind language, that she in fact respects me enough to stop flicking me because I communicate that it's annoying. And I say, you know what, that isn't particularly fair. But in your reaction to that act of unfairness, do you think that you could have tempered it a little bit? Why was Gwendolyn doing what she did? Well, she was doing it because she was trying to annoy me. And Gwendolyn's going like this. I'll bring in Gwendolyn one time. She's got these big blue eyes, and she's always got this, that's not me. Say, well, Gwendolyn, why are you flicking your sister? And she'll say something, she'll oftentimes say something really funny. She'll say, I really want my big sister to pay attention to me because she's preoccupied with an issue that is important, but I have something I want to share with her so I can participate in her conversation also. They take after their mom, let's be honest, okay? That's what reconciliation can become, but only because we first define our terms. In other words, when we engage in an act of defining our terms, when we say, this is how I understand this issue to be, you can say, I'm with you here, and here. This is the point at which we diverge. It sounds like this is where we're having an argument. Is this something that we can work on and find reconciliation on? And it might be yes, it might be no, but either way, it ceases to become, we disagree with one another because you're a bad person. That's the quickest way to erode trust in a relationship, is to scapegoat the other person for the failings of a particular type of argument. Defining terms is actually a really helpful solution to that particular problem. Let's pause. Let's try to figure out what it is that we're talking about before we get off the ground. And in the process of doing that, try to pinpoint the issue. That way, we don't follow what I consider to be a pretty prevalent form of American argumentation, where we dig in, we close off our bodies, we raise our voices, we furrow our eyebrows. Whatever we started arguing about is long in the past. By the end of the argument, you can't even remember what it is that triggered the argument in the first place, and we are airing our resentments about why the person in front of you should even exist. You guys are laughing. Hopefully it's an uncomfortable laughter, because I do it too. In those moments, let's pray that we are mindful enough about our conscience that we seek God's provision. His sovereign, transformative grace that says, oh yeah, I remember, Jesus, I told you I wasn't going to deny you, and the minute that third crow came up, I was gutted. And then you made me the foundation of your church. Does that make sense to everybody? We can be productively humbled. And when we learn to do that, when we're listening, even about trivial things, even about how to get through Scottsdale the most efficient way, which is something that my wife and I regularly argue about, we can find ourselves establishing a different kind of argumentative rhythm wherein we are being an encouragement to another person even when we disagree with them. So next week, part 2, we'll go through 4 or 5 more. Sound good?
Yeah.
All right.